Okay, so we need to get the elephant out of the room here. Some of you are angry because Reverend Suzanne has this really cool station in the back for our kids, and you want a special station too. Yes, you do. They do have them. Yes, but yes, they have sparkly markers and everything. Thank you for pointing that out. You can bring your own. That's okay too. Or bring a kid and then borrow a coloring pad. I tease, but anger is a really serious word. And I'll be really honest, it's not a word that resonates much for me. I think we've tried to cover a lot of the different negative emotions. I think each of us has a primary emotion that we tend to lead with, and anger just isn't mine. But I know it is for some of you because you've told me this last week, and a few of you even threatened to skip worship this morning because anger is your primary emotion. But I see some of you have joined us anyway, so congrats to you. Good work. Way to be brave. A wise friend of mine was telling a story about his trip to Kansas City a few weeks ago, and he had gotten really angry on the way to the airport. And he was telling our group, he said, sometimes people think I'm angry, and I'm not really an angry person. He said, but after 70 plus years of walking on this earth, I may have finally figured it out. He said, what people perceive from me as anger is actually just fear. It happens when I'm afraid. And I said, he goes, I don't know if that makes any sense to anybody or not. And I said, it makes total sense. I said, we've been reading as our Lenten devotional, we've been using our wisdom writer for Lent, David White, and he would totally agree with you. If you've been reading along either on Facebook or in the book with our wisdom writer, David White, he, maybe for you like he has for me, totally changed how I perceive and understand this word, anger. Because we usually talk about it in really negative terms. And David White says this: anger is the deepest form of compassion. What we usually name as anger is the violent outer response to our own inner powerlessness. What we've named as anger is the violent outer response to our inner powerlessness. He goes on to describe anger as when it illuminates for us what we belong to, what we wish to protect, and what we are willing to risk ourselves for. Or as I say, what are you really willing to go to the mat over? As Reverend Ryan mentioned in his prayers, we have several stories of Jesus being angry. We don't like to talk about them, of course. Yes, Jesus got angry. And one of the most interesting stories in the Gospels is one that people don't like to tell because it really makes Jesus seem like not a very nice person. It's a story of Jesus getting very angry and vandalizing the temple in Jerusalem. Now, if you go to your study Bibles and you look at the header in that section, you will see it says, cleansing of the temple. Now, we try to clean Jesus up and make him nice, right? So we say things like cleansing of the temple. Well, when I cleanse things, I'm either cleaning the house from flu and we're using Clorox wipes, right? Or there's some bad juju energy and I go buy some sage. Either way, what? Somebody's laughing at my sage? I do. We're making Native American prayer ties above your head, for heaven's sakes. They put tobacco in them. At least I left out the tobacco. But we try to clean Jesus up in this story and make him to be nice. And this is a really important story, this cleansing of the temple, vandalizing story. It's in all 4 Gospels. That's how I judge a story. I mean, even the Christmas story, even the birth story isn't in all 4 Gospels, but this one makes its appearance in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. And as often happens, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the story differently than John does. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we find this story at the end of the Gospels. We find them right before, just a couple weeks before Holy Week, what we now call Holy Week. It's arguably the straw that breaks the camel's back when Jesus goes into the temple and calls it a den of thieves and upends all the stuff and makes a total mess. But not in the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, we find this story in the very second chapter, at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. Jesus sets out in John's Gospel to be a rabble-rouser. In chapter 1, Jesus calls some disciples and then goes off to a wedding and makes some 5-star wine. And then he heads off to Jerusalem, where we find the story of cleansing the temple. Anybody ever cleansed anything with a whip? Because that's what we find here. First, Jesus makes wine, and then he makes a whip of cords to drive out both people and critters, and he tears the place up. Clearly, Jesus is angry. But if you apply David White's words to the Jesus story, hear it this way. It's illuminating what Jesus belongs to. It's telling us what Jesus wishes to protect and what he's willing to risk himself for. That makes a lot of sense to me. From the beginning of his ministry, if we read John's Gospel, Jesus says from the outset, I'm passionate about doing things different, about changing the way we come into the house of God, the way we change our relationship with God. He's certainly making the point that in this space, transformation is necessary. There is no doing it the way we've always done it anymore, says Jesus. And he's really angry about it. And maybe that's what creates the following in John, because people also have this angry sense that's been percolating just below the surface, and they go, that guy, I'm going with him, because he gets it. Or in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel, it angers those in power and authority enough that in just a few chapters over, they'll hang him up on an old rugged cross. Regardless of the gospel, Jesus uses anger to protect what he loves and risk himself for. And a week or so ago on Facebook, I saw a quote about this, a little meme about this verse. It says, wherever there is injustice, love does not sit idly by. Jesus turned over tables. Jesus disrupted worship as usual. Jesus practiced holy fury. And then the last line says, may we too love so boldly. May we too love so boldly. Now, most of the time, we get ourselves in trouble when we get all angry, right? We send kids to the timeout chair. Some of us send ourselves to the grown-up timeout chair. Some of us need to spend a little more time in the grown-up timeout chair, perhaps. Because most of us don't use it in this Jesus-like way. If it's used in this Jesus-like way, with purpose and intentionality, if it's done to bring change and transformation on behalf of others, if it's rooted in love and compassion, then that is holy fury of the Spirit. But that's not the way we see it played out most of the time. At least it's not the way I see it played out most of the time. Most of the time we see people or we ourselves use it to avoid dealing with stuff that makes us uncomfortable. Or we use it to make us feel powerful and strong. And it makes us feel like we are in control. But if we're really paying attention, that feeling of control is just the anger controlling us, not the other way around. This little prayer by Father Ed Hayes that I read a snippet of to open worship. When we fall into the place of not using it as holy fury, when from a more negative place we use this anger, it ends up, as he describes it, with as much energy as a nuclear power plant and just as dangerous. Like all the dangerous leaking radiation that seeps out in that passive-aggressive sort of way when you're angry at your boss, but you come home and you scream at your spouse. I suppose screaming at your spouse maybe is better than kicking the dog, I'm not sure. Either way, you're missing the point. That dangerous leaking radiation is seeping out to all the people around us, leaving a residue of death. One of my best girlfriends in college is now a safety engineer. And she makes sure that power plants are safe for the workers and for the community. Because, as Father Hayes said, if you're not paying attention, that radiation is seeping out all the time. And so this morning, I am your safety engineer, here to do a safety check on our spirits. This morning, we're not going to ask you to leave all of your anger to hang on the old rugged cross. That's just not realistic. But we are going to challenge you this morning to ask yourself, what's fueling that anger? Is it fueled by fear? Powerlessness? A desire for control? Are you afraid? Because that's a path, my friends, that will lead us to our own personal Chernobyl moments. But if we can do that safety check of our spirits and pay more attention, and as we've talked each week, turn into our negative energies, turn towards the trust of offering it up, and through the example of Jesus and the love of God, we might be healed. Because if we do that with our anger, and we can find it fueled by love and compassion, then that path will lead us on a Jesus-like journey toward the transformation we might find on Easter. May it be so. May it be so for us. Amen.